Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and I'd like to take you through now the Old Testament story. We begin in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, what I'm going to refer to as prehistory, and that doesn't mean that it didn't really take place, but that I cannot pin an exact date as to when these events take place. Yet, even though we have things like genealogies, I'm not sure that we're meant to take them and add up all of the begats and determine a specific date. Rather, I think that those are given in a stylized pattern with intentional gaps, and I think that's actually understood when we read it. So I have Genesis chapters 1 through 11, our prehistorical period, and that's going to begin first of all with creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where we have the story of God creating first of all the entire heavens and the earth, but then mankind. And he places them into the garden, and that takes place in those early chapters of Genesis. Next we read about the fall into sin, where both Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, are tempted, and a tempter arrives. We'll look and we'll see how that takes place. And they eat the forbidden fruit, and they're cast out of the garden. And not only are they, but all who come after them, all of their descendants, all of mankind then suffers a fall, and we begin to see the results of that, where there is greater and greater rebellion against God, greater sin that takes place, and that eventually brings not just the judgment of being cast out of the garden, but as mankind continues to grow and to grow in wickedness, that brings about a judgment of the flood, where the entire world, as it then was, perishes, and only Noah and his family are allowed to remain. They are saved by building and then entering the ark, they and the land animals that are with them. I say land animals because there probably weren't any goldfish bowls in the ark. But I have the judgment of the flood, and then one last part that takes place in Genesis chapter 1 through 11, and this is really in chapters 10 and 11, I read of the Tower of Babel, where after they've come out of the ark, they are told to go out and fill the earth, and instead, mankind, such as it is, seeks to unify itself through the building of a city and a tower that's top is oriented toward the heavens, and this becomes a sign of man's rebellion against God, and God divides them and does that by confusing the languages, and we'll see how that takes place. We now move from prehistory to what I'm going to refer to as the Old Testament history, although I was still in the Old Testament when I described those first 11 chapters of Genesis. But now it's a bit easier to assign dates and times to the events of which we read. So I'm beginning roughly, and I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, roughly around 2000 BC for the date of Abraham. And this is going to be the period of the patriarchs, going from 2000 roughly to around 1500 BC. People like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And then, allow me, I said 1500. If I wanted to be more exact, I'd probably say more like 1440, 1450. But I said I was going to paint with a very broad brush and round this off. So I have beginning around 1500, but really more like 1450, 1440 BC. I have the Exodus and the Exodus from Egypt and the Sinai event, and that leads the Israelites to going into the Promised Land. So I'll also include the period of the Judges in that, and that's going to take me, again, roughly, I'm not trying to be exact on these dates, around 1000 BC, which will bring me to the time of the kings, first Saul, and then David and Solomon, and of course after Solomon, the kingdom is going to be broken into two parts, Israel and Judah. But now is that period of the kings, first of all united Israel, and then the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's going to take me roughly to around 500. I can be more specific. I can say the year 580. Some scholars will say 586. Some scholars will say 587. I'm not going to quibble about the year. But around 586 BC, and that's just the number that I'm going to use for this class. we have the temple destroyed, and Israel's already been taken into captivity 150 years earlier in 721 BC, but now Judah's taken into captivity, and so I have that period ending, and I have the Babylonian captivity, but following that, Judah at least returns, and the Old Testament ends with that portion of history taking place where Israel has returned back to the land. They have rebuilt the temple, they have rebuilt the walls of the city, and now they're back in the land, and Old Testament history comes to a close. But we're not complete with the Old Testament. That's just the historical section that began with Genesis and took me all the way through those historical books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But I'm still not out of the Bible, and I still have those sections of the Bible. So I had the Torah. That was the first 5 books of Moses, and that told the story of the creation and the fall and the flood and the Tower of Babel, and then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as well as Exodus and the Sinai and the wilderness wanderings, and that was in the first 5 books of Moses that we call the Torah. Then I had the historical books that takes everything else, beginning with Joshua and his conquest, and the judges, and the kings of Israel and Judah, and the Babylonian captivity, and the return to the land. That's all in the historical books. And then after that, I have the poetic books, but they are written largely, with a few exceptions, largely within that period of the kings of Israel and Judah. Now, I said there's a few exceptions because there's one of the Psalms that's actually attributed to Moses. So that psalm, at least, would be much earlier. Some people have wondered about the book of Job, exactly when it was written, because there's no mention of Israel, and scholars have puzzled over it. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and put it still within that arena of somewhere in the poetic books. And likewise, there's one of the Psalms that talks about how by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. So that one at least is written at least as late as the Babylonian captivity, maybe even a little bit later as it's looking back to the Babylonian captivity. And so I have the poetic books written within that general period. And then I also have the prophetic books, and notice there I have them, the writing of them beginning just a bit later, perhaps with books like Micah or Amos or Isaiah, because remember the minor prophets are going to be, some of them are going to be written at exactly the same time as some of the major prophets are written. That means that the prophets aren't all in, excuse me, they're not all in chronological order. And being written as late as Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, probably being the very last of the prophetic books to be written, and those last 3 are written after the return from the Babylonian captivity. Now, I also want to speak a bit about what we could call a covenantal history, because in that history that I just gave you, there were a number of covenants that were given. And some are mentioned as early as the book of Genesis, some perhaps mentioned later looking back. For example, we could take the idea of a creation covenant, a covenant where God gives the land to his people. Now, his people, there was only 2 of them, so there's not a lot of people to give, but he gives a land to them, and he gives instructions in that land. And Hosea chapter 6 and verse 7 looks back to that and speaks about how Israel in his day is like Adam, and they have transgressed the covenant. Now, that assumes that Adam did transgress a covenant, even though there's no mention of an Adamic covenant or a covenant that God is making with man in the very early chapters of Genesis. But looking back at that, Hosea can speak of how Israel has been just like Adam in transgressing the covenant. So I think it's okay for us to speak of a creation covenant, even though the Bible doesn't specifically use that term. Likewise, we could speak about that Adamic covenant, where God not only has covenanted with Adam initially, but then also covenants and promises Adam certain things subsequent to the fall. Things that have to do with a future deliverer. He uses the term a seed, the seed of woman. And we'll look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 and see how that there is perhaps that covenant idea there. And ingrained, at least there in that covenant idea, I believe, is the idea of shedding of blood, because God makes for them coats of skin, and I suppose God could just have whipped them into existence, but it seems that the idea is probably that an animal had to give its life to clothe Adam and Eve. And that is going to be very near and dear to the idea of a covenant as we see it develop. We get next, and like I said, that's the salvation promise. We get next to the Noahic covenant. And here we're on more firm ground to refer to this as a covenant, because Genesis chapter 6 actually describes this as a covenant. And God says to Noah, I'm going to make a covenant with you. Actually, what he says in the Hebrew text, I am going to cut a covenant with you, because you always cut a covenant. And that means that you take an animal and you cut upon the animal. You actually kill an animal to seal the covenant. We'll see how that plays out as we begin to follow that in our study of Genesis. So you have a Noahic covenant that God cuts with Noah, and in that he gives a promise of the renewal of the land. Certainly there's going to be a destruction. That which was created is destroyed, but then there will be, can we call it a new creation, a recreation, and a refilling of the land that has been devastated by the flood. And God covenants with Noah and with all of creation for that. Next in Genesis we come, and these are all found in Genesis, or alluded to in Genesis at least. Next we find where God comes to Abraham and says to Abraham, I am going to make a covenant with you, Abraham, and with your descendants after you. And in that covenant, I'm going to promise you a land. So even though there had been a renewal of the land promised to Noah, God covenants with Abraham for a very particular place, that place that we know as Canaan, and that will eventually be the land of Israel. Now I've run out of space, so I need to sort of backtrack, and that's just in the interest of being able to put it on a slide. But the next covenant that I see is the Mosaic covenant, where God has now, in the days of Moses, takes the Israelites out of Egypt, brings them down to Mount Sinai, and enters into a covenant with the entire nation. And there he pronounces blessings and cursings that will be upon them. Blessings if they obey the terms of the covenant, cursings if they disobey, as they are in the land. And he promises he's going to bring them into the land. And when I turn to the page of Joshua, I see that taking place. That covenant is ratified. The next covenant that I see between God and men is when David comes on the scene. And whereas God had entered into a covenant with all of Israel, he now enters into a very special covenant with the shepherd turned king David, and with his descendants, where David is made king over the land, and God says, if you follow me, then I will make you and your descendants after you kings over the land, and you will be a kingdom. You will be my king, and I will reign through you. Now, that doesn't go much past David. In fact, Solomon finds himself worshiping other gods, and as a result, the kingdom is divided after the death of Solomon. And so I have a divided kingdom, and yet there's a promise that God was going to continue to do something through David, even though the kingdom had been and would eventually be torn. Even those tribes that remain would eventually be torn from his sons. And yet there's a promise that remains, that God is going to make a new covenant with both Judah and Israel. And so even though they are removed from the land, Israel is removed from the land in 721 BC, that's the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the southern kingdom of Judah is removed from the land in 586 BC. There is, after that, a subsequent return to the land, and all of that takes place with a promise that one of these days God is going to come back and he's going to bring the land back together. He's going to bring his people back together, and that happens in part as they come back into the land, and that God is going to give a new covenant to his people. And this new covenant is seen in the New Testament. In fact, that's what the word New Testament means. It means new covenant. And it's accomplished not through the shedding of the blood of an animal, but through the shedding of blood of God's own Son, who comes and becomes both the covenant keeper in the fact that he was without sin, but also the covenant keeper in that the penalty for breaking the covenant is placed upon him as well, so that he is our covenant keeper and suffers as though he were a covenant breaker. Suffers the penalty that we deserved upon the cross. He's the king who dies for his kingdom. Now I'd like to show you another chart. This one was actually put together by my senior pastor at St. Andrew's Presbyterian, T.J. Campos. I've got to give him credit. And I think he's done a wonderful job that just takes in this entire Old Testament and New Testament story. We begin, notice, with creation, and we think of the words that God spoke to Moses, where he says, "Indeed, as I live, there's coming a day when all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord." And throughout the Old Testament story, we see the development of a people, the people of Israel, and we see them brought into a land. They are first promised a land, and Abraham's there in the land. He doesn't own anything in the land except eventually, by the end of his story, a burial plot. But eventually the Israelites come in and they are given the land, and the nation grows up and is formed. So we have a people and a land and a nation and finally a king, and we saw how that was developed under all of those covenants. And everything is oriented toward coming to Jerusalem, coming to the mountain of the Lord to worship him, to praise him, where this is going to be the place from which God reigns. And that story brings me all the way to the New Testament. In the New Testament, I read about the king who dies for his people. And after that, Jesus is caught up into heaven, the Spirit comes, and the church is from Jerusalem sent out so that the gospel goes not just to the Jew, but to all people. And they are taking that message not just to the land of Israel, not just to the city of Jerusalem, but to the entire world, where they are going to make disciples of all the nations. And we have, yes, the king, but now he's the King of kings, Jesus Christ the righteous. So that, as God had said, "As I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord," so Jesus said, "If I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself." And that is exactly what takes place in the culmination of the story in the New Testament. So I began with the creation. I end up, in a sense, with a recreation. In fact, Revelation speaks of a new heavens and a new earth. And whereas in the Old Testament there was a temple that was eventually built, that place from which God would reign, Jesus comes and stands in the temple and says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'm going to raise it up." And we're told, just in case we didn't get it, that he's speaking of the temple of his body. So he is the temple, and he is the vine. In the Old Testament, the vine was used as a symbol of the nation of Israel, but in the New Testament we find out that Jesus is the one who's the vine. And in the Old Testament it spoke about the servant of the Lord, and we find out in the New Testament that Jesus is the servant of the Lord, the one who sits at his right hand, and that he is the promised seed. Throughout the Old Testament we saw the seed being Israel, but in the New Testament we find out he is the seed. He exemplifies everything Israel was supposed to be, and he becomes, in a sense, the new Israel.